Have you ever witnessed a moment when a human being was stripped of respect, right in front of hundreds of people, just because they looked like they didn't belong there? David Carter, a polite, calm black CEO, just sat in the VIP seat he had legally purchased and was pulled up, doubted, and treated like someone who didn't deserve it. No one asked him a question. No one gave him a chance to explain. Just a contemptuous look and a request to leave the seat. But if you were in his position, what would you do? Would you stay silent to keep the peace? Or would you stand up to defend your own dignity, knowing that it could shake the whole system? What makes a person calm enough to turn humiliation into reality and force the whole world to look back? And have you ever experienced a moment just wanting to be seen and treated like a real human being? I invite you to step into the story of Black CEO removed from VIP seat, then fired the whole crew in front of everyone. If you find this journey worthy of being known by many people, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel to join me in starting this humane journey. The cabin lights were warm that morning, a soft golden glow floating across polished leather seats. Flight 472 of Sterling Global Airlines was boarding slowly, the way early flights often did, quiet footsteps, the rustle of jackets being folded, the muted click of seatbelts being tested. Outside the window, Phoenix sunlight spilled over the runway, warming the glass like a gentle hand. David Carter placed his carry-on gently under seat 2A. The motion was unhurried, almost thoughtful, the way he did everything. He smoothed the sleeve of his charcoal blazer, sat down, and exhaled a steadying breath. It had been a long week meetings in Austin, a small community event in Tucson, and then a late-night board call that kept him awake long after midnight. At 53, David carried his strength quietly, a tall black man with a calm, measured presence, the kind of man people naturally made space for, even when they didn't immediately understand why. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and opened a message from his daughter. "Maya, Dad. Don't forget to eat something on the plane. And rest. I love you." He smiled. He always smiled at her messages. Family was the one thing that never demanded anything from him. He powered the phone off and looked forward. A flight attendant passed by and nodded politely. Everything felt normal, expected, peaceful, until it wasn't. A firm voice cut through the soft noise of boarding passengers. "Sir, I'll need you to stand up." David looked up slowly, thinking perhaps he was blocking the aisle or had missed an announcement. But the woman wasn't smiling. She wasn't even neutral. She looked offended. The flight attendant's name tag read Madison Clark, mid-40s, sharp jawline, posture straight like she ruled the cabin. She stood in front of David as if he'd trespassed on something sacred. David cleared his throat gently. "Is something wrong?" Madison crossed her arms. "Yes, you're in the wrong seat." David blinked once. "I believe this is 2A, first class." Her eyes narrowed, scanning him head to toe, lingering just a moment too long. "This seat is reserved for executive tier members. You'll need to move to the back or wait outside until we sort this out." There was no politeness in her tone, no professionalism, just certainty, unquestioned, unearned certainty. David spoke slowly. "I am an executive tier member." Madison tilted her head. "As I said, sir, please stand up." A hush fell over the cabin. A couple sitting across aisle exchanged uncertain glances. An older man shook his head, but stayed quiet, the way people often do when trouble isn't theirs. David reached calmly into the inner pocket of his blazer and pulled out his boarding pass, printed and digital. He offered them with both hands, a gesture of courtesy, even respect. Madison didn't take them gently. She snatched the papers like they were counterfeit bills. As she glanced at them, a young woman 3 rows back lifted her phone and started recording. Her name was Nora Diaz, a graphic designer traveling home for a family visit. She whispered into her mic, "This feels wrong already." David sat still, breathing evenly. He had learned long ago that black men didn't get the privilege of impatience, even when they paid full price, even when they followed every rule, even when they belonged. Madison's lips tightened. "Anyone can print this," she said flatly, flicking the paper once with her fingers. David inhaled slowly. "Ma'am, the digital boarding pass." She cut him off. "And the membership card. It's in my wallet," he replied. He reached for the card and placed it in her hand. The Platinum Elite emblem glinted beneath the cabin lights. Madison barely looked at it. "Sir, this isn't enough. I have an actual executive-tier passenger boarding for this seat." "Ma'am, it's not your seat," she said again, louder this time. There was something else in her tone now, a harshness that didn't match the situation, a belief hidden between her words, like she'd seen men like David before, and decided they didn't belong in seats like this. Nora's recording caught the moment perfectly, David's composed face, Madison's growing agitation, the uncomfortable shifting among passengers who wanted to look away but couldn't. A whisper floated somewhere behind, "Just let the man sit." Madison turned. "Sir, unless you have proper proof, I cannot let you stay in this seat. I've shown you everything," David said gently. "What else do you need?" "Cooperation," she said coldly. "So please stand up." David glanced at the row of passengers watching him with a mixture of pity and curiosity. He felt the familiar sting pressing against his ribs, an old ache he had carried his whole life. The ache of being doubted, misjudged, reduced. He saw himself at 10 years old, being asked in a department store if he was lost because kids like you don't shop here. He saw himself at 23, being followed by security in a mall while wearing his internship badge. He saw himself at 31, the day a taxi refused to pick him up in front of his own office building, and now here he was, 53, a man who had built companies, created jobs, lifted others behind him, yet somehow still being asked to prove he belonged. Madison tapped her foot. "Sir, I'm not asking again." David looked up at her calmly. His voice was soft, but something underneath it, something grounded and old, made her stiffen. "Are you absolutely sure," he said quietly, "that this is the road you want to take?" The words landed softly, like cotton, but the meaning struck hard. Nora's camera zoomed in, trembling slightly. This was the moment that would decide everything. Madison didn't blink. "I'm sure," she said, and with that, she stepped back, crossing her arms, sealing her decision. The cabin felt colder suddenly. The engines outside hummed faintly, like they sensed the shift in the air. David remained still, not because he was stubborn, but because he needed to gather the last bit of dignity left in him, a dignity no one could take unless he handed it away. He closed his eyes for a breath, just one, then opened them. "All right," he said softly, "if that's what you want." And slowly, quietly, David Carter began to stand. The walk no one expected was about to begin. David rose from seat 2A with a quiet steadiness that startled the entire row. There was something almost ceremonial in the way he moved, like a man stepping away from a place he had already paid for. Not in dollars, but in pieces of himself collected over a lifetime. He paused, hands relaxed at his sides, trying to breathe past the tightening in his chest. Nora Diaz kept recording. Her phone quivered slightly as she whispered into the mic. "This isn't right. People need to see this." The number on her screen climbed with a strange urgency, almost as if viewers could smell injustice happening in real time. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably. A middle-aged man lifted his hand for a moment, as if ready to intervene, but let it drop when Madison Clark glanced sharply in his direction. In every row, people watched the way strangers watch a small accident unfolding on a quiet street, unsure whether to step in or simply bear witness. Madison moved closer to David, her stance rigid. "Step into the aisle. Sir, you're holding up boarding." The insult wasn't in her words, but in the tone behind them, a tone that assumed he was trouble, an obstacle, something to be corrected. David swallowed slowly, trying to keep his thoughts from curling inward. He didn't want the cabin to hear the truth beating inside his ribs. He didn't want them to hear memories rattling awake like thin glass. He stepped aside. As he did, the man who would eventually take his place appeared at the entrance of the first-class section, a tall, polished-looking consultant carrying a briefcase with silver trim. His name was not spoken yet, but his expression said enough. It carried impatience, entitlement, and that familiar flicker of annoyance reserved for people assumed to be out of place. David watched him approach, watched the small smile he exchanged with Madison, watched the silent confirmation that he was the kind of passenger she approved of. The man glanced at David only briefly before shifting his gaze elsewhere. To him, David was simply a delay. Nothing more. The consultant stepped into seat 2A without hesitation. Nora whispered again, "Wow. They really think he didn't belong." Her phone buzzed in her hand as comments streamed in faster than she could read. People were tagging news channels, civil rights groups, and consumer watchdogs. The hum of digital outrage had begun. Madison cleared her throat. "Sir, please follow me. We need to verify your documents with the ground staff." David's jaw tightened a fraction. "I've shown you everything I have. You've shown me what you claim is proof," she answered. The sentence hit him harder than he expected. He felt something inside shift, a quiet crack he had spent decades keeping. Sealed, he had shown his ticket. He had shown his digital pass. He had shown his membership card. It was enough for anyone else, but not for him, not for someone who looked like him. He inhaled through his nose, trying to keep his voice steady. "I've followed every instruction. Then follow this one too." Madison's voice was cold. A younger flight attendant at the back of the cabin stepped forward. Her name tag read Ellie Matthews. Her expression held a flicker of conflict, but she lowered her eyes when Madison shot her a warning look. The silence she chose was heavy. It carried guilt and fear in equal measure. David walked toward the front of the cabin. As he moved, he heard a soft voice from row 3. An elderly woman touched her husband's arm and whispered, "It shouldn't be like this." Her husband nodded, but his face held the tired caution of a man who had lived long enough to know that speaking up sometimes made things worse. The walkway felt longer than before. Hands held phones in quiet defiance. The world was watching, yet no one seemed able to stop what was happening. That truth stung more than the humiliation itself. A teenage boy whispered to his mother, "Why are they making him leave?" She replied in a soft voice, "Because sometimes people forget we're all human." Something in David's heart pushed upward at those words, but he stayed silent. When he reached the small galley area, a supervisor joined them. His name tag read Oliver Hayes, a man in his early 40s with a professional calm about him. He looked briefly at David, then at Madison, then back at the boarding pass she handed him. "Sir," Oliver said gently, Could you wait by the door while I contact ground operations to verify your credentials? David nodded once. He stood by the forward exit, the cool air from the jet bridge brushing one side of his face. He could hear murmurs behind him, whispers carried through narrow spaces. People were upset, people were confused, people were angry, but none of it changed the moment he was living. Oliver returned after a short call. Ground staff is on the way. They'll clear this up, Madison interjected quickly. We cannot delay departure. If necessary, remove him from the aircraft. Something deep within David trembled, not with fear, but with a weary sadness. He wondered, briefly, how many times in his life he had been asked to step aside for someone else's comfort. 100 times, 1,000. He glanced down at his hands. They remained steady. He had trained them to be that way. Years of corporate negotiations, boardroom confrontations, public speaking, and high-stakes decisions had shaped him into someone who did not flinch easily. But humiliation was not something he had ever gotten used to. The ground operations officer finally arrived. A man named Samuel Price, carrying a small tablet. He reviewed David's digital pass, scanned the QR code, checked the system, then looked up slowly. Everything is valid. Samuel said, "His seat is confirmed." A small wave of relief rippled through the cabin behind them, but Madison stepped forward. The problem is not the documents. The problem is the attitude. He refused to follow crew instructions, and that is grounds for removal. The statement dropped into the air like a weight. Nora's voice trembled behind her phone. "She's just making things up now." Samuel hesitated. "Ma'am." He complied. "I saw him move. A delay is still noncompliance." Madison replied, "We have a schedule." David's eyes met hers. There was no anger in them, only resignation, a kind of quiet that made Madison shift her posture. If only for a second. He spoke softly. "What did I do that made you so certain I shouldn't be here?" Madison didn't answer. The cabin watched in collective silence. David drew in a breath, feeling the ache of 1,000 unspoken stories pressing against his ribs. He whispered, just loud enough for those nearby to hear, "I've spent my whole life trying to belong in places that were never denied to others." Samuel's throat tightened. "Sir, I'm sorry." David nodded. "It's not your fault." The officer lowered his eyes. Madison exhaled sharply. "Sir, you need to exit the aircraft now." A hush covered the aisle. A few passengers gasped. Nora's voice cracked as she said, "This is unbelievable." David straightened his shoulders. The calm that settled over him felt like a shield, built from years of surviving moments just like this one. He stepped forward, and the cabin watched the beginning of what the internet would soon call the Walk of Dignity. The air inside the front galley felt heavier than the rest of the cabin, as if the narrow walls had absorbed the tension and were now holding it in place. David Carter remained near the exit, the quiet hum from the jet bridge brushing faintly past him, like a cold reminder of where he currently stood. Behind him, whispers drifted from the rows of seats. They rose and fell like waves, carrying curiosity, sympathy, and a growing sense of disbelief. Samuel Price, the ground operations officer, turned once more to Madison Clark. His voice was steady, but there was an undertone of unease. "Ma'am, the system is clear. His documents are verified. His seat is confirmed under his name." Madison didn't flinch. "My concern," she replied, "is not the paperwork. My concern is behavior." David stood still, absorbing the word, behavior, a word that had been used against him more times than he cared to count, a word that allowed people to shape the story the way they wanted, a word used to justify decisions already made. Samuel hesitated. He hasn't demonstrated any inappropriate behavior. He hesitated. Madison insisted. He caused a delay. We have a schedule to maintain. A short, sharp breath escaped from Nora Diaz's lips. She had moved a little closer, keeping her phone angled toward the galley. The view count on her screen climbed rapidly. Comments flashed by too quickly to follow, but the anger was palpable, even at a distance. David watched all of this quietly. His hands stayed at his sides, fingers curled lightly to maintain control of his emotions. Inside his chest, though, a pressure grew, not loud, not explosive, but slow and familiar. The weight of being questioned without cause. The weight of being asked to justify his presence. He looked up at Madison. What exactly did I do that made you so certain I shouldn't be here for the first time? She blinked. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it happened. A tiny flicker of hesitation. You didn't comply quickly enough, she said, trying to steady herself. Ellie Matthews, the younger attendant who had stayed silent earlier, stood a few steps behind Madison. Her face held a conflicted expression, the kind seen in people who know right from wrong but fear the consequences of acknowledging it. She glanced toward David, then looked down at the floor. Oliver Hayes, the supervisor, stepped forward cautiously. His voice was controlled, almost too calm. Madison, perhaps we should reconsider. The situation is escalating. Madison stiffened. I'm the one managing this cabin. Oliver. And I'm following protocol. Oliver's eyes darted to the passengers watching them. Protocol shouldn't override fairness. Her response came instantly. Fairness is subjective. David felt something inside him twist, a quiet hurt that ran deeper than the moment. He lifted his gaze toward Oliver, studying the man's conflicted expression. Even in the midst of this turmoil, David sensed sincerity behind the supervisor's words. It was a reminder that some people still tried to do what was right, even when their voices shook. But it wasn't enough to change what was unfolding. A new voice entered the scene. A man in a suit, slightly out of breath, approached from the jet bridge. His ID badge identified him as senior airport security. Is this the passenger? He asked. Madison nodded as if relief had finally arrived. He refused to follow repeated instructions and is causing a disruption. David lifted his eyes. I complied with every instruction given to me. Madison crossed her arms. Not the first time I asked, Nora muttered softly. What is wrong with her? The security officer's expression remained unreadable. He turned to Samuel. Are the documents valid? Samuel nodded. Confirmed. And any threat to safety? No, sir. The officer sighed quietly and looked at Madison. If everything checks out, he should be allowed to return to his seat. Madison's jaw tightened. Crew authority supersedes passenger preference when we determine behavior is problematic. The officer hesitated. Technically, yes, but remove him, Madison said. Those two words froze the air. They lingered like a sentence passed down without trial. The security officer looked at David, his face apologetic. Sir, I'm sorry, but you'll need to step off the aircraft so we can resolve this. David closed his eyes for a brief moment. He wasn't praying, and he wasn't surrendering. He was centering himself, gathering the calm needed to withstand the humiliation about to unfold. When he opened his eyes, they were steady again. I understand, he said. The aisle remained silent as he took his first step, then his second. The passengers watched, unsure whether they should look away or witness what was happening. People felt the heaviness of it, even if they didn't fully grasp the weight David carried. As he walked toward the exit, the consultant who had taken his seat glanced up from his phone. His expression held a smug satisfaction, the kind that revealed more about his character than anything he could have said aloud. David met his stare for a fraction of a second. It wasn't a challenge. It was a quiet reminder that dignity didn't require approval. He continued forward. When he reached the door, he paused. The cold air from the jet bridge brushed against his face again. The feeling reminded him of something he had lived through long before boardrooms and investment firms. He heard his father's voice from decades past. "Hold your ground, son. Not with anger, with the truth of who you are." That memory steadied him. He stepped onto the jet bridge. Behind him, Nora's voice trembled as she spoke into her phone. "He's being forced off. Even after proving everything? This is so wrong." Her recording would travel across screens far beyond that cabin. But David didn't know that yet. He just knew he had been asked to leave a place where he belonged. He walked forward quietly, each step a mix of hurt, restraint, and an old resilience that seemed stitched into his bones. In that moment, the world had not yet realized that the man they were removing from the flight was the one holding the airline's fate in his hands. But the truth was coming, and it would land harder than any of them expected. The jet bridge stretched ahead in a quiet gray tunnel, the kind that always felt slightly cooler than the aircraft. David Carter took his first steps into it, each one steady despite the tightness building in his chest. The sound of his shoes touching the floor echoed softly through the narrow passageway. Behind him, the cabin door remained open for a breath, giving passengers one final glimpse of his back before it slid shut. For a brief moment, everything felt suspended. The murmurs inside the cabin faded into a distant hum. The soft, cycling buzz of the ventilation system filled the silence around him. David kept his gaze forward, even though a part of him wanted more than anything to look back. Not for approval, not for validation, but to see whether anyone else saw what was happening with clear eyes, whether anyone recognized the weight of moments like this, the kind that lodged themselves deep under decades of composure. The jet bridge floor vibrated lightly beneath him as luggage carts moved outside. A worker leaned against the wall further down, pausing mid-conversation with a colleague as he saw David walking alone. His eyebrows lifted with a hint of confusion, but he said nothing. People rarely did in situations like this. Curiosity won over courage, closer to the terminal door. Samuel Price followed with hesitant footsteps. He stopped a few paces behind David, struggling with something he couldn't name. Eventually, he cleared his throat. "Sir, I'm really sorry. I didn't agree with that decision." David didn't turn immediately. He let the apology settle into the space between them. Apologies were complicated things. Some arrived too late. Some arrived without power. Some arrived from people who meant well, but had no voice when it mattered. He finally spoke, gently. "I know you were doing your job." "Samuel." Samuel lowered his head. "Still, it shouldn't have gone like that." David nodded once. "I've seen it before." There was no bitterness in his tone, only an old truth delivered with worn-out grace. Samuel opened his mouth to respond, but words failed him. He stepped aside as a pair of gate agents entered the jet bridge. David resumed walking. The terminal opened ahead with its wide carpets and chatter of travelers moving between gates. The brightness of the concourse lights contrasted sharply with the muted tones of the jet bridge, making the moment feel like stepping from one world into another. Yet neither world felt welcoming at that moment. A mother holding a toddler glanced up from her stroller as David emerged. She recognized him from somewhere in the cabin, her expression tightening with awareness as she realized he was no longer on board. A few other travelers nearby also noticed. One whispered quietly, "Wasn't he in first class?" Another replied, "I think they made him get off." Every word landed like a pebble in David's chest. Near the seating area, two young airport staff members stared at the small screen of one of their phones. Footage of David standing in the aisle was already spreading. Nora's live stream had reached far more people than she ever anticipated. The staff glanced at him, then at the phone, connecting the pieces with uneasy expressions. David stopped walking for a moment, not because he couldn't continue, but because he wanted to gather whatever remained of the dignity that had carried him through countless rooms where he had never been welcome fully, even when his name was on the door. He closed his eyes just long enough to steady his breath. In the quiet space behind his eyelids, a memory surfaced. He was 17 again, standing outside a clothing store while a manager questioned whether he could afford to be inside. He remembered the heat of embarrassment rising up his neck. He remembered wishing someone, just one person, would step forward and ask why he was treated that way. No one did. The ache of that memory interlaced with the present, weaving itself into the fabric of this moment. It was remarkable how certain wounds lived long lives inside a man, reappearing at the touch of familiar cruelty. A voice approached from behind. "Sir, Mr. Carter." It was Oliver Hayes. The supervisor had left the aircraft to follow him. His breathing was slightly uneven from walking briskly down the jet bridge. There was regret in his eyes, plain and human. "Please wait," Oliver added. David turned slowly, not impatiently, but with a heaviness that made even small movements feel deliberate. Oliver's voice was soft. "I tried to speak up earlier. It wasn't enough. I know that." David studied him. There was sincerity in Oliver's expression, a kind of weary honesty that didn't ask for forgiveness but offered understanding. David responded quietly, "You spoke when you could. I noticed." Oliver swallowed hard. "Still, you shouldn't have been treated that way." David sighed. "I've learned that fairness isn't guaranteed. Not for everyone." Oliver shifted, struggling with the limitations of his own authority. "If there was anything I could do now—" "You've done what you could," David answered. His voice carried no resentment, only truth. Oliver nodded slowly, understanding that some situations couldn't be undone, only acknowledged. A new sound began to ripple across the terminal, the pinging chime of notifications. People around the waiting area were looking at their phones, adjusting their earbuds, nudging companions. The video had begun spreading beyond the cabin. Strangers were reacting, frowning, widening their eyes as they watched a calm man being treated as if he were out of place in a seat he had paid for. David didn't know any of that yet. He just sensed the shift in the atmosphere, the kind that came when a story started escaping into the world. He stepped toward the large windows overlooking the runway. The aircraft he had been removed from stood there, still at the gate. Baggage handlers moved beneath it. Fuel trucks rolled slowly. The engines remained quiet. It was a strange sight. A plane he was supposed to be on, continuing preparations as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. David felt something stir in him. Not anger, something deeper. A quiet resolve that rose from the core of his being. He had spent decades building his life on the belief that dignity wasn't something given. It was something you held, even when the world tried to take it from you. He looked at the aircraft one last time. His phone vibrated in his pocket. He hesitated before reaching for it. When he finally checked the screen, the name displayed there made him stop breathing for a fraction of a second. Ethan Miles, his personal attorney. The message read, Call me when you can. We have a situation." David exhaled and whispered to himself, "Not yet. Not here." He slipped the phone back into his pocket. His walk down that jet bridge would later be named the Walk of Dignity by millions of viewers. But for David, in that moment, it was simply the quiet act of a man who refused to let someone else define his worth. He turned away from the gate, shoulders squared, and walked toward whatever waited next. The humiliation was real. The hurt was real. But something else was rising within him now. Something stronger. The world had taken something from him inside that cabin, but it had also awakened something he had kept restrained for far too long. David Carter walked toward an empty seating area near Gate 12, seeking a small corner where he could breathe without eyes on him. His steps were quiet, yet each one felt weighted, as if carrying the memories he had tried so long to keep sealed. The embarrassment hadn't hit him fully yet. What settled in first was something more subtle, a tiredness that did not touch the body, but the spirit. He sank into a chair, the fabric cool beneath his palms. Through the large windows, the aircraft he had been removed from remained parked, the gate bridge still attached. Passengers inside were settling again, unaware of how their silence had shaped this moment. David leaned forward and rested his elbows on his knees. He clasped his hands, letting them hang loosely as he tried to steady his thoughts. His breathing was controlled, but inside him there was an old conflict stirring, something familiar, unwelcome, and deeply human. He closed his eyes for a moment. A question rose within him, one he had asked himself many times across his lifetime. How many more times will I be tested like this? That thought carried an ache he didn't speak aloud. The terminal continued moving behind him. Rolling suitcases thumped over carpet. Gate agents called out updates. Children laughed near vending machines. People lived their small moments, unaware that a larger story was beginning, its first ripples not far from them. David's phone vibrated again. This time, it wasn't a message. It was a call. He pulled the phone from his pocket and stared at the screen. Ethan Miles was calling. David answered quietly. "I'm here." Ethan's voice came through sharp, laced with urgency he rarely used. "David, it's everywhere." David's brow tightened. "What do you mean?" "The video. The live stream. Your removal. It's online. It's exploding." David didn't move. He only breathed. "We're already above 200,000 views," Ethan continued. "Clips are being shared by influencers, journalists, activists. People are furious." David swallowed gently. "I didn't want this to become a spectacle." "I know," Ethan replied, his tone softening. "But you need to prepare yourself. Reporters are asking for statements. Civil rights organizations are tagging your name. Sterling Global's legal team has already released a preliminary response that looks, let's just say it looks panicked." David exhaled a long, controlled breath. "I haven't even spoken publicly." "You won't have to," Ethan said. "Your silence is already speaking for you." David leaned back in his chair, letting his head rest for a moment. The terminal lights felt brighter now, almost harsh. He rubbed his thumb against the side of his phone in a slow, absent motion. "Ethan," he said quietly, "I didn't raise my voice. I didn't resist. I gave them everything they asked." "I know," Ethan answered, "and everyone watching knows, too." David closed his eyes again. It shouldn't take a camera for truth to matter. "No," Ethan said, "but sometimes the world only opens its eyes when someone else forces it to look." A pause drifted between them, not an uncomfortable one, but the kind that allowed both men to gather their thoughts. Ethan continued, "There's another reason I called." David straightened slightly. "You need to know something before it goes public." Ethan said, Sterling Global is trying to identify you. They don't know who you are yet, but they're close. David's jaw tightened. Let them. Are you sure about that? David did not answer right away. He looked out through the glass again, watching luggage handlers move beneath the aircraft. He saw the silhouettes of passengers shifting in the windows. He saw a crew member carry a tray of drinks toward the first-class cabin. People were settling back into their comfort. While he sat here alone, finally, he spoke. I'm done hiding who I am. Ethan's voice lowered. Then it's going to get loud. David nodded slightly. Maybe it's time. They exchanged a few more words, then ended the call. David sat still, the phone resting in his hand like an anchor keeping him grounded. A few minutes passed before another presence approached. Footsteps, soft but decisive, moved toward him. David lifted his head and saw Oliver Hayes standing there again, visibly conflicted. His posture carried the weight of someone who had just faced a difficult truth and couldn't walk away from it. Mr. Carter, Oliver said, his voice calm but heavy. May I sit? David gestured toward the chair beside him. Of course. Oliver lowered himself, leaning back slowly as if sorting through his own discomfort. For a while, neither of them spoke. Silence had its own language, and they both understood it. Finally, Oliver began. I stayed on the aircraft as long as I could. The passengers, they're uneasy. Some asked why you were removed. Others blamed themselves for not saying something. David let his gaze fall to the carpet. People saw what they were afraid to acknowledge. Oliver nodded. Madison is telling everyone she followed procedure. Procedure, David repeated softly. That's her word. Oliver clarified. Not mine. David looked at him. What's your word? Oliver hesitated before answering. Wrong. A flicker moved across David's expression. Not triumph, not satisfaction, just quiet acknowledgement. Oliver continued. I don't have the authority to overturn her decisions, but I need you to know, not everyone in that cabin agreed with her. David's voice softened. I know that. Oliver took a slow breath. There's something else. After you stepped off, one of the passengers gave me a message for you. David lifted an eyebrow. A message, Oliver nodded, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small folded piece of paper, worn with the creases of nervous hands. He placed it in David's palm. The handwriting inside was slightly shaky but clear. I'm sorry. I should have stood up. You deserved better. It was signed only with the initials R.T. David stared at the note for a long moment. Something warm and fragile rose in his chest. Regret. Understanding. Compassion. It wasn't enough to erase what had happened, but it was enough to remind him that even in moments of failure, people still carried conscience. He folded the note gently and slipped it into his jacket. Thank you. Oliver. Oliver nodded, unable to hide the emotion in his eyes. Before either of them could say more, a soft chime echoed across the terminal. Phones buzzed. Screens lit up. People murmured. David's phone lit again. This time with an alert from a major news outlet. Breaking video shows black executive forced off Sterling Global flight despite verified ticket. David felt something shift inside him. Not anger, something steadier. Resolve. This moment would no longer be contained inside a cabin. It had begun to spill into the world, and the world was listening. He rose from his seat slowly, carrying with him the calm that had always been his armor. Whatever waited next, he would meet it standing, and he would not be alone. David Carter remained near the wide windows of the terminal, watching the notifications on his phone multiply faster than he could read them. The glow from the screen illuminated the quiet steadiness in his face, a steadiness that came not from lack of emotion, but from years of learning how to carry it without breaking. Around him, the airport continued its rhythm. People hurried between gates. A child tugged at her father's sleeve. The intercom called for passengers to board a flight to Chicago. Life pressed forward, indifferent to the moment unfolding at Gate 12. Yet the tension around David seemed to settle like a thin mist, widening slowly as more people near the gate became aware of the headline flashing on their devices. A woman walking by paused mid-step when she saw his name appear on her screen. She glanced toward him, hesitation in her eyes, then looked away quickly, unsure whether to approach or keep her distance. Others whispered quietly, holding their phones close to their chests as they recognized the man at the center of the story spreading across social media. David slipped his phone back into his pocket. He wasn't avoiding the news. He simply needed to breathe without the weight of other people's reactions pressing into him. He lowered himself into a nearby chair, resting his hands on his knees, letting the stillness settle around him. His thoughts drifted back to the aircraft. To the moment, Madison Clark refused to acknowledge his identity, even as he offered every proof he had. To the silence of passengers who wanted to help but stayed seated. To the brief flicker of fear he saw in Ellie Matthews' eyes. To the quiet regret in Oliver Hayes' voice. He felt the sting of it all gather inside him like a bruise. A familiar inner voice, one he had heard throughout his life, rose again. "You didn't deserve that." Another voice answered it, softer, older, shaped by years of endurance. "But I survived worse." He pressed his palms together, as if holding those two truths between them. At that moment, footsteps approached, slow, deliberate. He lifted his head just as a man in a dark gray coat stopped in front of him. The man looked to be in his early 60s, with silver hair and eyes full of concern. He cleared his throat gently. "Excuse me. Are you David Carter?" David studied him briefly before nodding. The man lowered his voice. "I saw what happened. I was in row 7. I didn't speak up. I should have." David regarded him with calm, though his heart stirred at the confession. "You weren't obligated," David said. "Maybe not," the man replied. "But silence has a cost. I felt it the second you stepped off that plane." He extended a hand. "My name is Richard." David shook it lightly. Richard's grip held sincerity, a small but meaningful gesture. "Thank you for telling me," David said. Richard nodded, guilt still written across his features. "I hope the airline makes this right." "So do I," David answered. Richard gave him a respectful nod before walking away, leaving behind a lingering warmth in the air where he had stood. It was a simple conversation, nothing remarkable on the surface, yet it carried a kind of human weight that eased the tension in David's chest. Not long after Richard left, a notification lit David's phone again. This time it displayed a name he recognized instantly. Nora Diaz. She had sent him a message request. David hesitated before opening it. Mr. Carter, I never meant to record what happened, but once it started, it didn't feel right to stop. People needed to see. If you ever want the footage taken down or need help with anything, I'm here." David read the message twice. He let the words sink in. Compassion felt different depending on who it came from, but sincerity always sounded the same. He typed a response slowly. "Thank you, Nora. You showed truth. Don't take it down." He pressed send. A wave of clarity washed through him. He wasn't angry at the recording. He wasn't afraid of the attention. What unsettled him most was the knowledge that the world cared only because someone caught the moment on camera. He had lived through incidents just as painful, and no one had seen those. They had belonged only to him. This time, the moment didn't belong just to him. It belonged to everyone watching. A few seconds later, footsteps approached again. Lighter, quicker this time. When David looked up, he found Oliver Hayes returning, slightly breathless. "Mr. Carter," Oliver said carefully, "I didn't want to leave things as they were. There's something you should know." David straightened slightly. "What is it?" Oliver glanced around the terminal before continuing. "Madison is contacting the corporate office. She's insisting she was justified. She's framing your removal as a safety concern." David's jaw set almost imperceptibly. "Safety." Oliver nodded. "Her story is changing. She's saying your tone was threatening. She's saying you resisted. None of it matches what happened." David inhaled deeply. "I expected that." Oliver's eyes tightened. "I didn't want you to be blindsided. Corporate listens to staff reports before anything else." David appreciated the honesty in his voice. "Thank you for telling me." Oliver hesitated again, looking as though he wanted to say more. "I'm not supposed to leave the aircraft for long. I'll make sure the truth is noted in my report." David offered a small, genuine nod. "Your courage matters." "Oliver." The supervisor's eyes softened. "I hope it's enough." He stepped away, returning down the jet bridge. David watched him go. There was a grace in Oliver he had not expected. Something quiet, yet courageous. Something rare. A moment later, David's phone buzzed again. This time, Ethan sent a video link. "Watch this." David clicked it. The clip opened with Nora's trembling voice whispering, "This doesn't feel right." Then it showed Madison confronting him. It showed the calm in David's posture. It showed the smug glance from the consultant. It showed the tension rising and the silence of passengers holding itself like a shadow over the cabin. It showed the moment he said softly, "Are you absolutely sure that this is the road you want to take?" The video ended with him standing up, carrying his dignity with him. David watched it without blinking. He felt every second like a weight being pressed into his heart. When the video ended, he exhaled deeply. So this is what they saw. Ethan sent another message. "You should know something. People are demanding accountability. Sterling Global is scrambling. A journalist from the Tribune just reached out." David typed slowly. "No interviews. Not yet." Ethan replied, "Understood. But prepare yourself. This is going to escalate fast." David placed the phone beside him, the glow fading as the screen went dark. He leaned back in the chair, letting the air settle around him. His reflection stared back at him through the window. Calm, composed, but carrying a truth people were now beginning to see. A truth he had lived with his entire life. A truth that could no longer be ignored. This moment was no longer just a personal humiliation. It was becoming something larger, something rising. And David understood with a clarity that felt almost still, the storm had begun. The commotion in the terminal had shifted from murmurs to a quiet current of energy that traveled from one passenger to another. People who had not even been near Gate 12 began approaching, drawn by the headlines flashing across their screens. Something unusual was happening, and everyone felt the pull of it. David Carter remained seated for a while longer, his posture calm, but his thoughts churning beneath the surface. He had always carried himself with quiet dignity, but inside him lived a lifetime of experiences that had shaped his restraint. Today, those memories pressed against him like a tide, trying to rise. A nearby television at the gate suddenly changed its broadcast. The word Sterling Global Incident appeared in bold across the screen. A news anchor spoke in measured tones, describing an ongoing situation involving a black executive removed from a first-class seat despite verified documentation. Passengers gathered near the screen. Some watched with widened eyes. Others shook their heads. A few looked back at David, realizing they were sharing space with the man at the center of those headlines. David's gaze remained steady, though a part of him felt exposed, as if every private emotion he had tried to contain was now laid bare for strangers to see. Footsteps approached slowly. Nora Diaz appeared, holding her phone with both hands. Her face carried a mix of worry and determination. "Mr. Carter," she said gently, "I hope it's okay that I came over." David nodded once. "Of course." Nora hesitated before taking the seat next to him. She placed her phone face down, as though giving her full attention was the least she could offer. Her voice was soft, careful. "I never expected the video to spread this fast. I thought maybe a few hundred people would see it. But now—" Her voice trailed off. David studied her expression. "You showed what really happened. That matters." Nora lowered her eyes. "I just wish I had spoken up sooner." My hands were shaking. I felt awful watching it unfold. David let his voice soften. "Fear makes silence easy. But you did speak, in your own way." Nora blinked back emotion. It didn't feel like enough. It was, David said. It created a window for truth. She exhaled slowly, relieved that her actions hadn't caused him more pain. For a while, they simply sat there, the hum of the terminal weaving around them like a soft blanket. Across the walkway, another phone alert chimed, then another and another. People began whispering louder now. "That's him, the CEO. Not sure, but he looks calm. I'd be furious." David heard none of the words clearly, but he felt their vibrations. He wasn't trying to hide. He simply didn't want this moment to consume him. He had been hurt before, humiliated before. But what happened on that aircraft carried a different weight. It had witnessed, it had witnesses, and it now had the world. A shadow fell across him. A woman stood with a small clipboard pressed to her chest. Her badge identified her as an airport liaison. Her voice carried a respectful tone. "Mr. Carter, if you're comfortable, we can escort you to a private waiting room." David looked up slowly. "Is that necessary?" "It may help with privacy," she said gently. And with the volume of calls coming in— "What calls?" She hesitated. "Journalists, networks, legal offices. Some have contacted airport management directly asking to speak with you." Nora's eyes widened. "It's moving that fast." The liaison nodded firmly. "Yes." David took a measured breath. He didn't feel fear, only an awareness that he had stepped into something larger than his own personal experience, something he could no longer downplay or brush aside. He looked at the liaison. "Before I agree, tell me something." "Yes." "Sir, what is the airline doing right now?" The woman swallowed lightly. "They're meeting internally. Corporate has requested immediate reports from every crew member, and the captain has filed a note saying he was not aware of the removal until after it occurred." A quiet ache flickered inside David. The captain hadn't even known. The decision had been made by one person, and the rest had followed out of habit, fear, or indifference. David shook his head. "Privacy isn't what I need. Truth is." The liaison nodded, understanding his meaning. She stepped aside respectfully. At that moment, a familiar voice called out from a short distance away. "Mr. Carter." It was Richard, the passenger from earlier. He carried a determined look this time, no longer weighed down by guilt alone. Walking beside him was another man from the cabin, someone David vaguely recognized as having watched the confrontation with discomfort. The new man stepped forward. "Sir, I was in row 3. I didn't speak up either. But I want you to know, the way you handled it was extraordinary." David lifted an eyebrow. "Extraordinary?" "Yes," the man replied. "You stayed composed. You showed more dignity than any of us would have in your place." David looked away for a moment. Praise had never felt comfortable to him, especially in situations born from pain. Another voice joined them. A younger woman approached timidly, wringing her hands as she stepped closer. David recognized her as someone who had watched the argument unfold while clutching her travel bag nervously. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I wanted to say something. I felt it in my chest. But I froze." David offered her a calm nod. "You weren't alone," she exhaled shakily. "It won't happen again. Not if I see something like that." One by one, people who had watched him walk that aisle came forward. Some offered apologies. Others offered thanks. A few simply wanted to acknowledge what they had witnessed. The small circle forming around him did not feel like attention. It felt like conscience awakened. After several minutes, Richard stepped forward again. "I hope this doesn't come out wrong," he said gently, "but I think this moment might become very important." David studied him. "Important, yes," Richard said quietly, "because what happened to you could have happened to anyone. But in you, people see someone who didn't bend." David didn't reply immediately. The words stayed with him, lingering somewhere deep. Suddenly, another alert buzzed on Nora's phone. She glanced down and gasped. "Mr. Carter?" David turned his head slightly. "It's happening," Nora said, her voice trembling. "A senator just tweeted about your video. National media outlets, too," Richard added softly. "This is about to become a national conversation." David leaned back in his chair, letting the truth settle. He hadn't chosen to spark a movement. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't asked for revenge. All he did was remain human in a moment designed to strip him of that humanity. And it was enough. Enough for millions to see themselves in him. Enough to stir the conscience of a country wrestling with old wounds. Enough to make an airline tremble beneath the weight of its own decisions. David stood slowly, quiet but resolute. Nora looked at him. "Where are you going?" David's voice held a gentle strength. To respond to who David lifted his phone, its screen lighting his calm expression, to the world. David Carter walked a few steps away from the growing crowd, needing a small pocket of space where he could gather his thoughts without the weight of expectation pressing against him. Even as he moved, people turned their heads, following him with their eyes. Some looked at him with sympathy, some with anger on his behalf, others with a kind of reverence usually reserved for moments that felt larger than life. He stopped near a tall column, placing one hand against the cool metal. His chest rose and fell slowly, each breath measured with the patience of someone who had learned long ago that emotion must move through the body with care, not force. His phone buzzed again. A message from Ethan Miles appeared on the screen. "David, the airline issued a temporary statement. They're claiming procedural miscommunication. They're trying to defuse this." David stared at the words. His fingers tightened slightly around the phone. Procedural miscommunication. It was the kind of phrase corporations use to wash away responsibility. A phrase crafted to soften wrongdoing without admitting its shape. His heart sank for a moment, not because of anger, but because of the familiarity. He had seen this dance many times before. words crafted to hide truth rather than reveal it. Another message followed. Reporters are on site now. They're looking for you. David lifted his gaze. He could already see a few journalists moving through the terminal with cameras, scanning faces. The story was spreading faster than the airline could control. And for a brief moment, David wondered how his daughter, Maya, would feel when she saw all of this. His hand moved instinctively toward his pocket. He unlocked his phone and opened their last conversation. Her simple message glowed softly. I love you. David closed his eyes for a moment. That love had always grounded him more than any title or achievement. Footsteps approached from behind. He turned and saw Nora Diaz standing near him, holding her phone close to her chest. Her eyes were softer now, no longer filled only with worry, but with a sense of shared responsibility. Mr. Carter, she said quietly, I think people want to hear from you. David tilted his head. What would I even say? Whatever you feel, Nora replied. People saw what happened. They want to know what it meant to you. David let her words linger. He wasn't someone who lived for attention. He didn't chase crowds or cameras. He built companies, guided teams, mentored young people. His life was rooted in action, not spectacle. And yet, in this moment, silence felt like it would allow the airline's narrative to take the place of truth. More footsteps approached. Richard returned, along with several other passengers who had watched the incident unfold. Their expressions carried quiet support, not pressure. Richard spoke gently. Mr. Carter, sometimes the world needs to hear the truth from the person who lived it. David felt something inside him shift, a realization. Maybe the question wasn't whether he should speak. Maybe the question was whether he could afford not to. Just then, the airport intercom crackled overhead. A boarding announcement sounded for a flight in the adjacent gate. The noise filled the space around them, yet it could not drown out the growing attention gathering around David. A young airport staff member approached timidly. Her badge read, Leona. She cleared her throat. Sir, forgive me for interrupting, but would you like access to the small press room near the entrance? You don't have to talk to the media, but it might give you some privacy. David studied her carefully. She seemed earnest, her voice trembling slightly. He appreciated the kindness in her offer. No, he said softly. I'm staying right here. Leona nodded with respect and stepped away. David turned toward the large windows once more. Outside, the aircraft that had removed him was finally beginning to back away from the gate. The sight created a peculiar feeling, as if he were watching a chapter close in real time. The engines hummed, distant and indifferent, carrying with them the echoes of what had happened inside. Nora approached him again. If you speak, I can record it, but only if you want. No pressure. David thought about it. Slowly. He nodded. I'll speak. Nora steadied her hands. Several passengers stepped back to give him space, while still forming an audience. The journalists at the far end of the concourse noticed the movement and began approaching carefully. David stood tall. His calm presence created a stillness in the noisy terminal. Nora lifted her phone, her voice trembling slightly as she said, We're live. David took one gentle breath. His voice emerged steady and low, shaped by restraint but carrying an unmistakable gravity. I didn't plan to be here like this today. I didn't expect attention. I didn't expect headlines. All I expected was a seat I paid for, a seat I believed I had earned. But sometimes, it doesn't matter what you earn. It doesn't matter what you carry in your wallet, or how calm you remain, or how many times you comply. Some people will still look at you and see a question mark, someone to doubt, someone to move aside. His words floated through the terminal with startling clarity. I wasn't removed because of a misunderstanding. I was removed because someone chose not to see me, and because others were afraid to challenge her choice. A quiet ache appeared in his voice, not anger, but a deeper truth. It's not the removal that hurts the most. It's the pattern, a pattern that follows men like me in stores, in boardrooms, in neighborhoods, on sidewalks, in classrooms, and in seats we're told aren't ours. The onlookers grew still, phones lowered slightly, as if listening mattered more than recording. David continued, I didn't shout. I didn't resist. I showed everything they asked for. And still, it wasn't enough. For some of us, it is never enough. A pause, not for dramatic effect, but because the truth needed space to breathe. But I'm here. I'm still standing. And I won't let this moment be twisted into anything other than what it was. Not hostility, not miscommunication. It was a denial of dignity. His voice softened. And I believe dignity is not something people can take from you, only something you can choose to give away. When he finished, silence filled the space around him. Even the flight announcements seemed to fall quiet for a brief moment, as if the entire terminal had paused to absorb his words. Then, from somewhere behind, gentle applause began. It grew slowly, cautiously, until more people joined. The sound remained respectful, not loud, not chaotic, a quiet acknowledgement of truth. Nora lowered her phone, eyes glistening. That was powerful. She whispered. David nodded. It needed to be said. A journalist approached, hesitant. Mr. Carter, are you willing to confirm your identity? People are asking who you are. David looked directly at him. Yes, he said calmly. My name is David Carter. Another journalist stepped forward. Are you affiliated with any organization? Yes, David replied, his voice gentle but firm. I am the founder and CEO of Carter Equity Group. A murmur passed through the growing crowd. Recognition, respect, surprise. Someone whispered, He's the CEO. Another said, He runs a major firm. David remained composed. He wasn't flaunting status. He was simply stating truth. The journalist continued, Mr. Carter, would you like to make a public statement to the airline? David considered it for a moment. No, he said softly. They will hear what they need to hear soon enough. He glanced at Richard, at Nora, at the passengers who stood near him with sincerity in their eyes. This was no longer his burden alone. The world had started watching, and the real reckoning was only beginning. The applause faded gradually, leaving behind a stillness that felt almost sacred. David Carter remained standing for a moment, letting the quiet settle around him like a warm cloth. He had spoken from a place he rarely revealed to strangers, and the vulnerability of that truth lingered in the air. When he stepped away from the small gathering, the journalists continued murmuring among themselves, preparing their segments, sending files back to their networks, but none of them followed him too closely. They seemed to sense that this man carried himself with a kind of gravity that demanded respect. David walked toward a quieter corner of the terminal, settling once again near a long row of windows. The hum of airport life filled the background, yet he felt strangely untouched by it. His mind rested in a deeper place, somewhere between reflection and resolve. His phone vibrated again. It was Ethan Miles. David answered without hesitation. David, Ethan said, breath unsteady. They know who you are now. Sterling Global's board just convened an emergency meeting. I got a call from one of our contacts inside the company. They're rattled. David remained silent for a moment, not because he was surprised, but because he was arriving at a realization that had been forming slowly since the jet bridge. He finally spoke. "They should be," Ethan continued. They didn't expect the story to grow this fast. They definitely didn't expect the man removed to be the CEO of Carter Equity Group, a major shareholder. David pressed his hand against the armrest of the chair. His voice remained soft. Ownership never protected me before. It won't protect me now." "That's exactly why this is powerful," Ethan said. "The public isn't reacting because you're a CEO. They're reacting because what happened to you happens to people who don't have your resources, and it happens quietly. You just exposed it." David breathed deeply, letting the truth of that statement sink in. Ethan lowered his voice. "There's something else. The board wants to speak with you directly. They're trying to reach you through their legal department." David closed his eyes. "Let them wait." Ethan paused. "Are you sure?" "Yes," David said softly. "They spent years expecting silence. They can hold theirs for a while." Ethan allowed a small exhale. "Understood. I'll handle everything on my end." They exchanged a few more words before ending the call. David lowered the phone into his lap. Outside the window, the afternoon sun glinted over the runway, casting long bands of gold and shadow that moved with the shifting clouds. The sight soothed him in a way he didn't expect. He allowed himself to drift inward again, not into pain, but into memory. He remembered sitting outside his grandmother's house when he was 12, listening to her talk about the dignity of stillness. She had told him, "Carry your truth quietly. David, when you finally speak, let it be because the moment needs your voice, not because your pride needs the noise." He smiled faintly at the memory. It felt as though she were sitting beside him again, her presence warm and steady. A voice broke the reflection. "Mr. Carter." He looked up to find Leona, the liaison, approaching again. Her posture held a renewed sense of urgency. "There's been another development," she said carefully. "Sterling Global's CEO, Mr. Anderson, just released a statement. He's calling the incident deeply troubling. He says the airline does not tolerate discrimination." David's expression didn't change. Did he acknowledge what actually happened? "No," Leona said softly. "Just general language. Nothing specific yet." David nodded once. "That's their way." She hesitated, then asked, "Would you like me to escort you somewhere less? Public things are getting louder out there." David looked around. He saw a few people filming from a distance, though respectfully. Some stood in small groups, discussing what they had seen, but none pushed toward him, none disturbed his quiet. He shook his head gently. "I'm fine here." Leona nodded and stepped away. Not long after, Richard walked toward him again, slower this time, as if unsure whether he was intruding. "Mr. Carter," he said, "would you mind if I sit with you for a moment?" David gestured toward the seat beside him. "Please." Richard lowered himself into the chair with a long breath. "I've been thinking about what you said, that it was a denial of dignity. I felt that, not because it happened to me, but because I watched and did nothing. I keep replaying it." David gave him a quiet glance. "Regret can be a teacher if you let it." Richard nodded. "I know, and I want to learn from it." He paused, searching for the right words. "I think the reason your story is spreading so quickly is because people feel something personal in it. Not because you're a CEO, but because most of us have been silent when someone needed us. You're calm. It makes people look at themselves." David inhaled slowly. "It makes me look at myself, too." Richard looked surprised. David leaned back, eyes drifting toward the glass again. Because moments like this remind me how much of my life has been spent holding myself together for the comfort of others. I've learned to stay composed, to stay gentle, to stay reasonable, even when I'm hurting. And sometimes I ask myself, who taught me to carry pain quietly? And why did I believe them? Richard's chest tightened. He didn't try to respond. He simply listened, sensing that listening mattered far more than speaking. David continued, I'm strong. I know that, but strength shouldn't require silence. Richard nodded slowly, the weight of those words imprinting themselves into him. A young woman approached cautiously. She wore a dark blue business coat and carried a notebook pressed against her side. She introduced herself quietly. Mr. Carter. My name is Anna. I'm not a reporter. I work for a nonprofit advocacy group. We've been following the situation carefully. When you're ready, we'd like to support you. No pressure. David appreciated the kindness in her tone. Thank you. I'll reach out soon. Anna stepped away gracefully, not wanting to impose. Richard stood. I'll give you some space, but thank you for letting me speak to you. David offered a small nod of gratitude. When he was alone again, he felt his phone vibrate once more. This time, it was a call. The name on the screen made his pulse shift. Sterling Global Airlines Executive Office. David didn't answer. Not yet. Instead, he let the phone vibrate until it stopped. He allowed the silence that followed to settle. He looked out the window again. The world outside moved steadily. The world inside the terminal moved with growing intensity. For the first time since he stepped off that aircraft, David felt something deep inside him begin to rise. Not anger, something brighter, something quieter, something that felt like a choice. This wasn't just about humiliation anymore. It was about truth colliding with power. And power, when confronted by truth, revealed what it truly was. David exhaled, calm and sure, and whispered to himself, They're not ready for the conversation I'm about to have with them. David Carter watched the missed call notification disappear as the screen dimmed. His reflection appeared faintly against the black surface, softened by the glow of the terminal lights. He studied that reflection with a calm that didn't come from indifference. It came from choice. He knew that if he answered now, the conversation would be shaped by urgency, fear, and corporate survival instincts. But the story had grown larger than one flight. It had grown larger than him. This was no longer about responding. It was about deciding. He slipped the phone back into his jacket pocket, just as footsteps approached. Ethan Miles appeared, slightly out of breath. He must have navigated the crowded airport at a near jog. When he reached David, he lowered into the seat beside him, adjusting his tie that had become uneven during the rush. I got here as fast as I could, Ethan said quietly. I figured you shouldn't go through the next part alone. David looked at his longtime colleague, the man who had helped him navigate mergers worth billions and crises that would have shattered weaker teams. Ethan's presence carried a steady warmth that grounded him. Thank you, David said softly. Ethan leaned forward, placing his elbows on his knees. You're becoming the headline of the year. Every network is running the footage. Social media is calling what happened the quiet storm. People are gathering outside Sterling Global's headquarters demanding accountability. David exhaled, long and thoughtful. It's strange, isn't it? How fast a moment can turn into a movement. Ethan nodded. Because the moment didn't belong only to you. For a while, they watched the flow of passengers passing through the terminal. Some recognized David from the coverage and gave him silent nods of respect. Some simply glanced, then looked away gently. sensing that this man carried more weight than he cared to show. A few minutes later, a shadow approached. It was the senior airport security officer, the same one who had been present when the chaos unfolded. He paused a respectful distance away. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice steady but tinged with something more personal. "May I speak to you for a moment?" David nodded. "Of course." The officer stepped closer. "I've been reviewing the internal footage. I needed to understand where I failed. I saw every detail, every expression, every hesitation." He paused, searching for the right words. "I realized I never asked you one thing. Are you all right?" The question held a sincerity that caught David off guard. He answered slowly. "I'm standing. That's something. But this goes deeper than a seat, deeper than a misunderstanding. You saw all of it. So you know." The officer nodded. "Yes. And I want you to know something else. I'll be submitting a report that reflects the truth. I won't soften it. I won't hide it. It might cost me something, but integrity should never come second." David's eyes softened. "Thank you. That takes courage. It takes more courage to live what you lived." The officer replied, "If there's ever anything you need, you know where to find me." As he stepped away, Ethan exhaled deeply. "It's starting. David, people are choosing sides, and most of them are choosing the right one." David said nothing, yet there was a quiet pride forming in the stillness around him. A moment later, another voice approached. Richard had returned again, almost hesitantly, carrying a paper cup of coffee he never sipped. "Mr. Carter," he said, "I know you've had enough people interrupting you today, but I think I should tell you something." David looked his way gently. "Go ahead." Richard's hand trembled slightly as he spoke. "I work in corporate conflict resolution. I've seen hundreds of high-pressure situations. None felt like this. The airline's top leadership is panicking. They're drafting statements, probably rehearsing apologies." He swallowed, gathering courage. "But I hope you don't let them get away with just words." David held his gaze. "What do you think I should do?" Richard's voice softened. "Make them see. Make them change something real. Not because of fear, but because they need to understand they failed human beings, not policies." David regarded him with a thoughtful pause, appreciating that this man, once silent, now carried his own sense of responsibility. "I hear you," David said. Richard nodded and stepped away, giving him space once more. Ethan leaned closer. "You know what they're expecting, right? They expect you to take a settlement, release a joint statement, and let the news cycle move on. They expect a business solution." David closed his eyes, resting his head against the back of the seat. "But this isn't a business problem." "No," Ethan replied. "It's a moral one." David felt the weight of that truth settle into his bones. He could almost feel his grandmother's voice again, guiding him carefully through the fog. He opened his eyes when he sensed movement ahead. A woman in her late 40s approached slowly. She wore a navy blazer and carried herself with the poise of someone accustomed to mediating difficult conversations. She stopped in front of him. "Mr. Carter," she said gently. "My name is Dr. Helen Brooks. I'm here on behalf of several civil rights organizations. We've been following everything since the footage surfaced." She paused, her voice dipping with empathy. "If you choose to pursue this publicly, we're ready to support you. If you choose privacy, we'll respect that too. We don't want your voice to drown in noise. We want it to lead." David listened quietly, heart steady. "Thank you," he said. "I haven't decided my next step yet. "But I will." Helen gave him a slow nod. "Whatever you decide, we'll stand with you." She stepped back, leaving him with a reassuring smile before departing. Ethan observed the exchange with a deep breath. You're not alone in this. Maybe that's the part they fear most. David's phone vibrated again. Another call. Sterling Global Airlines Executive Office. This time, the vibration felt heavier, as if the moment itself demanded an answer. David lifted the phone, holding it carefully between his fingers. He didn't accept the call immediately. He allowed the tension to breathe, to grow into something he could shape. He pressed the screen. A voice came through at once, strained and formal. "Mr. Carter, this is Marcus Anderson, CEO of Sterling Global Airlines. I want to personally apologize. What happened is unacceptable. We would like to meet immediately to discuss a resolution." David listened without interrupting. He allowed the CEO's voice to fill the room, yet he offered no comfort with his silence. When Anderson paused, David finally spoke. "Mr. Anderson," he said calmly, "you don't need to rush to resolution. What you need is clarity." A sharp inhalation sounded through the call. David continued, "Tell your board I'll meet them, but not to accept an apology, not to negotiate a settlement. I'll meet them to talk about reform." "Reform," Anderson repeated, unsettled. "Yes," David said quietly. "If this airline wants to rise again, it will rise through accountability, not statements." Anderson hesitated. "We can discuss all of that. Name the time and place." David thought for a long moment before answering. "Tonight," he said. "Your headquarters. Bring every decision-maker." Anderson agreed quickly, relief mixing with anxiety in his tone. When the call ended, Ethan stared at him. "You're ready for this." David held his gaze, voice steady. "I'm ready for the truth to walk into that room and take its seat at the table." He stood, adjusting his jacket with deliberate calm. The moment felt like the opening of a door he had waited a lifetime to open. This wasn't retaliation. This wasn't revenge. This was responsibility. And as he walked toward the exit with Ethan beside him, the whispers in the terminal softened behind him like a tide receding, leaving the shore clearer than before. David Carter was no longer the man they had pushed out of a seat. He was the man walking toward a room unprepared for the truth he carried. The ride to Sterling Global's headquarters carried a quiet electricity, the kind that tightened the air without ever announcing itself. David Carter sat in the back of the black sedan while Ethan Miles rode beside him. Neither spoke much. Words felt unnecessary when the world outside the windows was already murmuring loudly enough through the glow of street lamps and passing headlights. David kept his gaze steady, watching the city unfold in long streaks of silver and amber. He wasn't preparing for a confrontation. He was preparing for clarity. There was a profound difference. When the car turned toward the district of polished high-rises, Sterling Global's glass tower rose in the distance like a monument built from equal parts pride and blindness. Its sleek facade reflected the city's lights, yet something about its shine felt hollow tonight. The car stopped beneath the covered entrance. A cluster of reporters stood behind barriers, murmuring into microphones, glancing toward the vehicle as if sensing something important was unfolding. Security staff kept them at bay, but the tension in the air was unmistakable. David stepped out with a calm that quieted even the crowd's low chatter. Cameras clicked from a distance, not aggressively, but with a measure of respect. His presence seemed to slow the night, as if time itself paused to acknowledge the weight of what was coming. Ethan walked beside him. "They're expecting a negotiation?" he whispered. David's voice remained soft. They'll receive a lesson. Inside the lobby, silence followed them like a shadow. The polished floors reflected the tall ceiling lights, creating long silhouettes that stretched before each step David took. A receptionist appeared, posture stiff from nerves. "Mr. Carter," she said gently, "the board is waiting for you on the 34th floor." David nodded. "Thank you." The elevator ride upward felt strangely serene. There was no tremor in his hands, no hesitation in his breath. His heart moved not with anger, but with conviction, the kind that settles into a man who has spent years learning to hold his dignity without trembling. When the doors opened, Ethan walked a step behind him as they moved down a long corridor leading to the executive conference room. Through the glass walls, they saw silhouettes gathered around a long table. The moment David reached the doors, an assistant opened them with careful precision. Inside, the entire board sat waiting. Some stiffened, some shifted uncomfortably. Others attempted to mask their nerves with artificial professionalism. At the head of the table sat Marcus Anderson, the CEO who had called him earlier. His expression carried the polished remorse of a man accustomed to repairing crises with well-chosen statements. Yet tonight something in his posture betrayed deeper anxiety. David walked into the room, his presence alone carving a stillness through the tense air. He remained standing for a moment, letting the atmosphere settle, letting their eyes meet his without a barrier of excuses. Anderson stood abruptly. "Mr. Carter, thank you for coming. Please sit." David offered a polite nod but chose not to sit immediately. Instead, his gaze traveled across each face at the table with a quiet steadiness. "I'm here because you asked," he said calmly, "but this conversation will not be the one you expected." A ripple of discomfort moved through the room. He took his seat only when the room's silence turned attentive rather than defensive. Ethan sat slightly behind him, serving as both witness and anchor. Anderson cleared his throat. "First, let me express our sincere apology. What happened today is unacceptable. The employees involved have been suspended, and an internal review is underway. We deeply regret." David raised a hand gently. The motion was subtle, yet it halted Anderson's sentence instantly. "I didn't come here for regret." David said, "I came for responsibility." The room fell completely silent. He leaned forward slightly. "Let me ask a simple question. If the footage had never gone public, what would your response have been?" A few board members exchanged uneasy glances. David continued before anyone could speak. "Would you have called me? Would you have issued a statement? Would you have suspended employees? Or would the incident have been labeled a misunderstanding and quietly buried?" The truth hung heavy. No one answered. Their silence was the answer. David let the moment breathe. "That is the problem," he said softly. "Not the incident itself, not the individuals who acted from bias, but the system that thrives on silence." The chief operating officer shifted, attempting to restore the structure of the meeting. "Mr. Carter, we understand the severity of the situation, but surely there must be a path forward that avoids unnecessary escalation." David looked at him, not harshly, but with clarity that cut straight through any attempt at deflection. "Escalation happens when people hide the truth," he said. "I'm offering transparency." He paused, then added, "Tell me, does this airline want to rebuild its reputation or simply survive the news cycle?" The COO swallowed hard. Anderson interjected quickly. "We want to rebuild. Truly. We are prepared to listen. We're prepared to take meaningful action." David took a long breath and placed both hands on the table, fingers interlaced. "Good," he said. "Then understand the following. What happened on Flight 472 is not just a stain on your airline. It is a mirror showing everything you have refused to see. He let his eyes linger on each executive, one by one. You run a company that prides itself on service, yet your employees are trained to judge before they serve. You speak about excellence, but your standards are built on assumptions rather than empathy. Anderson looked down, jaw clenched. David's voice softened. Your airline did not treat me as a man. It treated me as an inconvenience. And if it did that to someone with my title, imagine how it treats the people without titles to protect them. A few executives lowered their heads. Ethan watched, feeling the shift in the room. It wasn't anger that moved them. It was truth. David continued, So here is what I expect. Not as a victim, not as a CEO, but as a man who believes in accountability. He unfolded a document he had prepared earlier. It wasn't thick, but it carried the weight of something irreversible. I want systemic reform, he said. Training designed around real human respect, not corporate slogans. Evaluation systems that penalize discriminatory behavior. Community partnerships that rebuild trust you've broken. Public transparency reports, and leadership workshops for every senior executive. Anderson blinked, stunned. This is comprehensive. It's necessary, David replied. The chief financial officer leaned forward. Implementing these programs could cost the company tens of millions. David looked at him with calm clarity. Prejudice already cost you something far harder to regain. Trust. The CFO sat back, unable to respond. Anderson finally exhaled, long and slow. Mr. Carter, we need time to review this. David nodded. You'll have your time, but know this. If you choose public image over honest reform, your problem will not be me. It will be the millions who saw the truth. A quiet trembling moved through the room. Not fear of him, but fear of the reflection he placed in front of them. David stood. This isn't about a seat, he said gently. It's about the value of a human being. Every human being. The room remained still as he walked toward the exit. Just before leaving, he added one final sentence, spoken softly yet resonant as a bell. Dignity isn't negotiable. He stepped into the hallway where the air felt clearer, where the weight he carried felt shared rather than solitary. As the elevator doors closed, Ethan looked at him with awe. David, you didn't just speak to them. You led them. David gave a quiet smile. I wasn't leading them, he said. I was reminding them. He didn't explain what he meant. The meaning lived in the silence that followed. And in that silence, the world shifted again. The elevator descended with a gentle hum, carrying David Carter and Ethan Miles through the quiet air of the upper floors. The glass walls revealed a sweeping view of the city, lights glowing like a constellation. Yet the beauty outside couldn't match the feeling stirring within David. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't relief. It was something quieter and heavier. Something that sat beneath the ribs like an unspoken truth. When the doors opened to the main lobby, the atmosphere felt strangely different. A few employees lingered near the reception desk, whispering to each other in low tones. They didn't stare. They didn't point. They simply watched David with a mix of curiosity and something that resembled admiration. Ethan noticed the subtle shift, too. You've changed this building already, he murmured. David gave a soft smile. Buildings don't change. People do. The two stepped outside into the open air. A soft chill brushed against David's face, grounding him. The sedan waited near the curb, but David didn't walk toward it immediately. He paused, gazing at the city stretched before him. The night felt alive, humming with possibility and consequence. Ethan stood beside him, hands tucked into his pockets. "Do you want to head back to the hotel?" David shook his head slightly. "Not yet. I need a moment to let everything settle." They walked toward a quieter corner near the plaza. A granite bench sat beneath a row of decorative lights, casting a warm glow across the pavement. David sat, elbows resting lightly on his knees, and allowed his thoughts to surface. "You know," he said softly, "I didn't expect the board to listen. Not truly." Ethan nodded. "They listened because you didn't speak as an investor. You spoke as a man carrying truth they couldn't ignore." David lowered his gaze. Truth can be a difficult companion. It rarely arrives gently. "That's why it needs people like you," Ethan replied. For a moment, silence wrapped around them, gentle and weightless. Cars passed in the distance. A few pedestrians strolled along the sidewalk, their footsteps rhythmic against the concrete. David took comfort in these ordinary sounds. They reminded him that life moved forward, no matter how heavy the day had been. A sudden vibration in his pocket brought him back. He pulled out his phone. A message from Madison Clark. Ethan leaned closer as David opened it. "Madison, I just saw the update. The board meeting leaked. People know you confronted them. I hope you're all right." David stared at the message for a moment, thoughtful. He typed slowly. "David, I'm standing. That's enough for today." He sent it, then set the phone aside. Ethan watched him quietly. "How long have you carried this weight?" Ethan asked gently. David took a moment before answering. "Long enough to recognize its shape. Bias doesn't strike in one moment. It builds, layer by layer, sometimes in words, sometimes in silence, sometimes in the way someone looks at you and decides your worth without ever asking who you are." His eyes drifted toward the glow of the streetlights. "You learn to swallow it, to keep your posture straight, even when your spirit bends. And over time, you convince yourself that calm is your armor. But calm can also become a cage." Ethan nodded slowly. "You opened that cage today." David gave a soft, almost wistful smile. "Maybe, but breaking a cage isn't the same as healing what lived inside it." They sat quietly until footsteps approached. A young man wearing a Sterling Global badge stopped a respectful distance away. "Mr. Carter?" he asked softly. David turned slightly. "Yes, I work in the operations department," the man said. "I heard what happened, and I saw the video. I just wanted to say thank you. What you did tonight matters. More than you know." David felt something shift gently inside his chest. A quiet affirmation. A reminder of why he chose to stand firm when backing down would have been easier. "Thank you," David said. "That means a great deal." The young man nodded and walked away, leaving behind a warmth that lingered in the air long after he disappeared. Ethan let out a long breath. "You see, this isn't just about leadership. It's about legacy." David tilted his head slightly. "Legacy is a heavy word. It fits you," Ethan replied, "even if you pretend it doesn't." David didn't respond, not because he disagreed, but because the idea of legacy made him think of the people who shaped him long before the world ever knew his name. His grandmother, his mother, the mentors who whispered truth into his life when he was young and unsure. They were the ones who taught him to hold dignity even when the world withheld it. As these memories surfaced, a movement in the distance caught his attention. A woman walked toward them with careful steps, her hands clasped before her. David recognized her, Dr. Helen Brooks. She stopped in front of him, her expression carrying the calm strength of someone who had witnessed countless stories of injustice and resilience. "Mr. Carter," she said softly, "I didn't mean to intrude. I wanted to give you something." She offered him a small envelope. David accepted it with gentle curiosity. He opened it slowly. Inside was a printed copy of an email. The sender's name at the top made his breath pause. Senior Airport Security Officer. He read the message carefully. Mr. Carter, I reviewed the footage again after speaking with you. I realized I failed you in ways I should have recognized sooner. I want you to know that I've already submitted my full report. No omissions, no softened language. I acted too late on the plane. I will not act too late now. With respect. David folded the paper, his eyes heavy with quiet gratitude. He means it, Helen said. Some people only change when the world watches. Some change because they finally understand. He's the latter. David looked at her. Thank you for bringing this. She smiled gently. I knew you'd need to know that the truth you spoke tonight is already moving through the cracks. Before leaving, she added, you didn't confront a company. You confronted a culture. And cultures don't change with anger. They change with courage. When she walked away, Ethan turned toward David. She's right. David leaned back on the bench, letting the weight of everything settle deeper. Courage isn't loud, he whispered. It's quiet enough to hear your own heart tell you the truth. Ethan gave him a long, thoughtful look. So what now? David looked at the towering building behind them. The lights in the upper floors still glowed, shadows moving inside as executives began drafting responses, statements, perhaps even reforms. What happens now, David said, is that they start asking questions they should have asked years ago. And tomorrow, I'll make sure they ask the right ones. Ethan smiled. That sounds like you. David stood. Let's go. There's more work ahead. They walked toward the waiting car, the night carrying a different kind of stillness now. Not heaviness, not uncertainty, expectation, because change had taken its first breath. And tomorrow, it would speak. The next day arrived without fanfare, carried not by the glow of a sunrise, but by the steady hum of a world that had begun whispering David Carter's name with a mixture of outrage, admiration, and curiosity. News networks replayed the scene from Flight 472 on a loop. Commentators debated what it meant for the future of the corporate ethics. Strangers across the country repeated his calm words, treating them like a quiet anthem. David sat at a small wooden table in the corner of a hotel lounge. His cup of coffee sat untouched, steam fading slowly. Ethan Miles had stepped away to answer calls from their legal team, leaving David alone with the soft murmur of guests and the faint scent of roasted beans. His thoughts felt heavy yet focused. He didn't replay the incident anymore. He replayed the conversation that had followed, the boardroom, the silence, the shifting eyes of people forced to confront something they had spent years ignoring. A gentle voice pulled him back. Mr. Carter. He lifted his gaze. A woman in her late 50s stood beside his table. She wore a dark green coat and carried a leather-bound notebook pressed against her side. Her expression held a mix of respect and trembling vulnerability. David offered a small nod. Yes, I apologize for interrupting, she said quietly. My name is Margaret Lane. I work in Sterling Global's customer service division. She hesitated, drawing a steady breath. I wanted to thank you. Many of us have stayed silent about things we witnessed for years. What you did, it shook something awake. David lowered his shoulders slightly, his voice gentle. I didn't intend to shake anyone. I only intended to tell the truth. Margaret gave a faint smile. Sometimes the truth shakes us even when we're not ready. She paused before adding, There's a meeting scheduled today. The executives invited representatives from every department. They want feedback about the reforms you proposed. David watched her with quiet curiosity. "Do you trust them to listen?" Margaret exhaled. "I think they have no choice now. And maybe they finally want to." She stepped back respectfully and left the lounge. David watched her disappear around the corner, a soft ache spreading in his chest. There was something powerful about seeing ordinary people step forward, unprompted, carrying pieces of courage they long believed they lacked. Footsteps approached again. Ethan returned, sliding into the seat across from him. "You're making headlines again," he said, but in a good way. "People are quoting your words from last night." David looked down at his hands. "I didn't plan for any of this." "I know," Ethan said, "but maybe that's why it matters. You weren't chasing attention. You were reclaiming dignity. People feel that." David absorbed the thought without speaking. A few minutes passed before another interruption arrived. This time, it was someone he didn't expect. Marcus Anderson. The CEO of Sterling Global approached their table with measured steps. His suit looked perfectly pressed, yet the heaviness in his eyes revealed how much weight he carried since the previous night. "Mr. Carter," Anderson said quietly, "may I sit with you for a moment?" David nodded. Though his posture remained calm and guarded, Anderson sat, folding his hands on the table. "The board met again early today. We reviewed your proposal. It opened a conversation we should have had a long time ago." Ethan leaned back slightly, observing without interfering. Anderson continued, "I came to tell you personally that we are committed to adopting your reform plan. All of it." David studied him carefully. "Not as a gesture, as a responsibility." "Yes," Anderson said, his voice soft. "As a responsibility." David's tone remained even. "Reform isn't a press release. It's practice. It will require transparency, accountability, a willingness to change from the inside." Anderson nodded slowly. "I understand. And I want to make this clear. You weren't treated unfairly because of who you are. You were treated unfairly because of who we failed to be." David appreciated the honesty, even if the wound still held its shape. Anderson added, "We scheduled a company-wide meeting later today. Employees will get the chance to voice their concerns. We want you to attend, not to defend yourself, but to speak, to guide us." David looked down at the table, the silence between his breath stretching gently. "I'll be there," he said. Anderson thanked him quietly and excused himself, leaving the two men at the table once more. Ethan let out a low whistle. "They're bending?" David shook his head slightly. "Bending isn't the same as understanding. We'll see which path they choose." They left the hotel together a short while later. The ride to the headquarters carried a tension different from the night before. Not fear, not anger, expectation. Outside the building, employees gathered in small groups. Some held notebooks, some held coffee cups, some simply held each other's anxious glances. As David approached, conversations hushed. Dozens of eyes softened with recognition. Inside the main auditorium, hundreds of employees filled the seats. Representatives from every department had gathered. A palpable mixture of nerves and anticipation filled the room. David stood near the back beside Ethan, observing quietly. Marcus Anderson stepped onto the stage. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "Last night we confronted a truth many of us should have seen, but didn't. Today we begin addressing that truth head-on." He paused before adding, "And the man who experienced our failure is here. Not as an adversary, but as a guide." A ripple moved across the room as Anderson invited David forward. David walked to the stage. The lights overhead cast a warm glow on his face. But he didn't look toward the spotlight. He looked toward the people, faces of different ages, races, and stories, people who had lived their own quiet battles, people who knew what it meant to be unseen. He inhaled slowly. "I'm not here to shame anyone," he said. "I'm here to remind us all that dignity isn't given by rank or uniform. It's something each of us carries, something we owe to one another." He paused, letting the words settle. "What happened to me on that plane wasn't just a mistake. It was a reflection of habits that have gone unchallenged for too long. Habits built from fear, assumptions, and unspoken biases. Some employees lowered their eyes. Others held his gaze with heavy emotion." David continued, "I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm asking you to be aware, to question the thoughts that make you judge before you understand, to stand up when silence feels easier, to treat every life with the weight it deserves." His voice softened. "You don't have to be a CEO to lead. Leadership begins in the smallest act of respect." For a moment, the room held its breath. Then someone stood. Margaret Lane. Her voice trembled, but carried truth. "We want to do better," she said. "We just needed someone to show us how." Others rose slowly, one by one. A flight attendant, a mechanic, a gate agent, a customer support representative. Their voices blended. "We want this change. We're tired of the old way. We're ready to rebuild this company together." David felt a warmth rise in his chest, a quiet swell of hope. When Anderson returned to the stage, he spoke with newfound resolve. "Effective immediately, we will begin implementing the Carter Reform Initiative with full transparency to our employees and the public." The room erupted into applause. Not loud, not celebratory, but heartfelt, intentional. When David stepped off the stage, Ethan placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "You didn't just push back," Ethan said. "You moved them." David breathed deeply, feeling the shift in the building, the shift in the people, the shift inside himself. "No," he said softly. "They moved themselves." And as he walked toward the exit of the auditorium, the realization settled over him like a quiet dawn. He had entered this building as a man removed from a seat. He was leaving it as a man who helped an entire system find its footing again. The afternoon light filtered softly through the tall windows of Sterling Global's atrium, leaving long ribbons of gold across the floor. Employees drifted through the space in quiet clusters. Some wiped their eyes discreetly. Some exchanged small smiles, uncertain but hopeful. The air carried the feeling of a place that knew it had crossed an invisible threshold. David Carter walked beside Ethan Miles through the lobby, moving slowly, as if listening to the heartbeat of the building around him. Something deep inside him sensed that today marked more than a turning point for the airline. It marked a turning point for countless people who had waited too long for their voices to matter. Yet with each step, David felt the weight of exhaustion settle into him. Not the exhaustion of anger, the exhaustion that comes from holding meaningful conversations with a world that had not always been ready to hear them. Ethan glanced at him gently. "You've done enough for one day." David shook his head softly. Days like this aren't measured by effort. They're measured by what they awaken. He paused near a row of seating just outside the atrium. The hum of employees continued behind them, but here the space felt quieter. David lowered himself onto one of the benches and let the moment settle. Ethan joined him, but remained silent. He understood well that David did not crave applause. He craved understanding. After a few moments, footsteps approached. A familiar figure emerged from the corridor. It was the senior airport security officer. He stopped several feet away, head bowed slightly before he spoke. "Mr. Carter, I didn't want to interrupt the meeting earlier, but I needed to see you again." David straightened gently. "I'm glad you came." The officer stepped closer, his hands clasped in front of him. "I submitted my formal statement this morning. No edits from the legal team, no redactions encouraged by senior staff. I made sure the truth stood exactly as it happened." David saw sincerity fill the man's eyes, the kind that only comes from someone who has confronted himself deeply. "I appreciate that," David said softly. The officer hesitated before continuing. "There's more. I spoke to my team. We're implementing new protocols for handling onboard conflicts. They're small steps, but they're ours to take." David nodded. "Change begins with the person willing to move first." A faint smile flickered across the officer's face before he excused himself. After he left, Ethan exhaled quietly. It must feel surreal. David leaned back, eyes drifting toward the high ceiling. It feels necessary. Moments later, another figure appeared. This time, someone David hadn't expected to see again. Richard. He approached with careful steps, as if unsure whether he deserved to stand in the same space as the man he once watched be wronged. "Mr. Carter," Richard said, voice steady but humble. "I'm here because I need to say something I didn't say yesterday." David gestured for him to continue. Richard drew a breath. "When I watched the video last night, I saw my own silence staring back at me. I've stayed silent before in situations where I shouldn't have. Yesterday was just another moment I froze. I'm not proud of it." David studied him quietly. "Acknowledgement is the first step toward change." Richard nodded. "I want you to know I'm committed to doing better. Not because of public pressure, because of what I saw in your composure. You taught me something without ever raising your voice." David felt a quiet warmth settle in his chest. "Thank you for telling me." Richard's eyes glistened slightly before he stepped aside, giving space once more. After he left, David remained seated, absorbing the flow of humanity that kept presenting itself in small, heartfelt pieces. The world didn't apologize all at once. It apologized in individual steps, and each step mattered. The day wore on, and as David and Ethan prepared to leave the building, a familiar voice called out gently from behind them, "Miss Carter?" They turned. Madison Clark walked toward them, her presence steady and composed. She offered a modest smile, though her eyes carried a depth of emotion. "I'm glad I caught you," she said. "I saw the live recording of the meeting. You spoke with a grace most people can't muster under far less pressure." David gave a small nod. "It needed to be said." Madison stepped a little closer. "I know we've spoken professionally before, but today wasn't just professional. It was deeply personal for so many people who've been overlooked or dismissed. I wanted to thank you for showing what accountability looks like when it's rooted in dignity." David studied her for a moment. He had always known Madison to be perceptive, but today her insight felt heavier, more heartfelt. "I didn't speak for recognition," David said softly. "I spoke because there comes a time when silence becomes too costly for the soul." Madison breathed in quietly. "I hope you know how many people you helped without ever intending to." Before David could respond, Ethan approached with a soft smile. "It's true. You shifted something major today." David let the words settle, though humility kept him from accepting them too quickly. Madison added, "The board is preparing a follow-up announcement. They're including you in the credits for the reform initiative." David paused. "This isn't about credit. It's about responsibility. That's why you're the right person to credit, Madison replied gently. Her sincerity settled into the room like a warm blanket. David offered her a grateful nod before she excused herself. Once she disappeared around a corner, Ethan let out a slow breath. You know, Ethan said, most people fight with noise. You fight with silence that carries more weight. David smiled softly. Noise demands attention. Silence demands reflection. Ethan chuckled under his breath. You're going to end up in leadership textbooks someday. David shook his head lightly. If people learn anything from me, I hope it's that calm isn't weakness. It's power in its most disciplined form. The two men stepped outside, walking into the open plaza. The sun hung low, casting a muted amber glow across the city. Traffic moved steadily. People crossed streets with the rhythm of ordinary life, yet something about the world felt different. David paused near the edge of the plaza, gazing at the city he had come to know well. The air carried a quiet resonance, as though the collective heartbeat of countless unseen stories had begun shifting. Ethan noticed the stillness in David's posture. You're thinking about what happens next. David nodded gently. I'm thinking about how change rarely announces itself. It shows up in the way people start speaking differently, in the courage they find inside themselves, in the willingness to face uncomfortable truths. Ethan tilted his head. Do you feel hopeful? David took a long, thoughtful breath. Hope isn't a feeling. It's a discipline. It's choosing to believe the world can change even when you've seen every reason to doubt it. The words lingered in the air. Then David turned toward the waiting car. Let's go, he said softly. There's more ahead than behind. Ethan smiled. As long as I'm beside you, we'll handle it. David nodded, and together they stepped forward, the weight of the day settling in a way that left room for something else. Healing and healing, once begun, rarely stops halfway. The days that followed unfolded with the pace of something quietly monumental, not the loud chaos of breaking news, nor the fleeting rush of public outrage, but the steady, deliberate rhythm of a world adjusting its lens. David Carter returned to his office in Manhattan to find it flooded with messages, not just from journalists or investors, but from strangers, school teachers, retired pilots, parents, students. People who had never met him yet felt connected through the dignity he carried when the world tried to strip it away. He read each message slowly, absorbing the weight of every sentence. Your composure helped me find mine. My son watched the video and asked why you stayed so calm. I told him it's because some storms are defeated in silence. Thank you for giving words to something I've lived my whole life. David responded to as many as he could, though he knew he would never reach them all. He didn't try to be a symbol. Symbols were heavy, and he was still human. Ethan Miles sat across from him in the office, scanning through updates on Sterling Global. The Carter Reform Initiative is trending again. He said, employees are sharing videos of their training sessions. It's changing the company from the inside. David nodded, though his expression remained thoughtful. Change is fragile. We have to nurture it. Ethan smiled. You sound like a man ready to build something bigger. David looked out the window. The skyline shimmered beneath a soft haze, skyscrapers rising like tall stories etched into the horizon. I don't want to build something bigger, he said. I want to build something truer. Just then, his phone buzzed. A text from Madison Clark. Madison, I'm near your building. Do you have a moment? David replied simply. Yes. A few minutes later, she arrived at the office. Her presence carried a quiet steadiness, like someone who had reflected deeply over the past few days. She took a seat across from David. "I came because I thought you should know something. Last night, Sterling Global's board voted unanimously to adopt your reforms. Not temporarily, permanently." David's gaze lowered gently. "That's more than I expected." Madison offered a faint smile. "They didn't do it to restore their image. They did it because you left them no room to ignore what they saw in themselves." Ethan exhaled from across the room. "That's what happens when truth walks into a boardroom instead of a PR strategy," Madison continued. "There's more. The board wants you to serve as the company's senior advisor on ethical leadership, not just for the airline, for their entire corporate group." David leaned back, thoughtful. "I'll consider it, but my decision will depend on their long-term commitment, not their short-term relief." Madison nodded. "I thought you'd say that." "Before leaving," she added softly, "whatever you choose, I hope you know you've changed more than a company." Her voice softened further. "You changed the conversation." After she left, silence settled in the office. Not heavy, not strained, comfortable. Ethan spoke first. "She's right. You know, you didn't just fix a broken moment. You forced an entire industry to rethink how it sees people." David tapped his fingers lightly against the desk. "Systems only change when the people inside them decide they're tired of who they've been." Ethan nodded. "And now, what are you tired of?" David let out a slow breath. "I'm tired of dignity being treated like a luxury." The words hovered in the space between them. Moments later, a knock sounded at the door. It was Oliver Hayes, a longtime friend and one of the early mentors in David's career. His face carried the calm warmth of someone who had witnessed many storms and survived them with perspective rather than bitterness. Oliver stepped inside. "I hope I'm not intruding." David stood to greet him. "Never." Oliver studied him for a moment. "You look heavier than the day you walked onto that plane." David offered a soft, honest smile, heavy with purpose. Oliver chuckled gently. "That's the best kind of heavy." They talked for a while about life, leadership, and the quiet battles men like David had fought for decades without acknowledgement. Eventually, Oliver stood to leave. Just before stepping out, he touched David's shoulder lightly. "Whatever history says about you, make sure you recognize yourself in those words." When he left, David sat in silence again. This time, he let the quiet wrap around him like a warm coat. He thought of the young boy from years ago, standing outside his grandmother's house, hearing her tell him that dignity was something no one could give, but many would try to take. He wondered what she would say now, seeing him face a world that had tested him in ways even she could not have predicted. He whispered softly, as if speaking to her memory, "I didn't lose my place. I reclaimed it." Later that week, Sterling Global invited David to return for the formal rollout of the Carter Reform Initiative. Employees gathered once again in the large auditorium. The atmosphere felt different this time. Not tense, not uncertain, hopeful. Margaret Lane spoke first, sharing how the program had already begun shifting attitudes in customer service teams. The senior airport security officer followed, describing new protocols and the courage to confront bias immediately rather than hesitantly. Richard stood next, voice firm yet emotional as he acknowledged the silent habits he had shed. Finally, David was invited to the stage. He stepped forward slowly, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes not as a burden but as a shared intention. When he reached the podium, he didn't speak right away. He breathed in deeply, letting the moment settle. "My story began with a seat," he said softly. "Not because I wanted it to, but because someone decided I didn't deserve the one I paid for. He gazed across the room. That seat was never just a seat. It was a mirror showing us how easily dignity can be dismissed when we judge before we understand. The room remained still. I didn't fight for revenge. I fought for recognition, for every person who has ever been asked to prove their worth twice as hard, for everyone who has ever been told they belong in a lesser place. His voice softened even more. Dignity is not a privilege. It's a responsibility we owe to one another. He paused, letting the truth breathe. This reform initiative isn't mine alone. It belongs to everyone willing to lead with empathy rather than authority, with awareness rather than assumption, with humanity rather than haste. Applause rose slowly, not exploding, but growing like a tide rising with purpose. When David stepped down from the stage, employees reached out. Some squeezed his hand. Some whispered thank you. Some simply met his gaze with silent acknowledgement. Outside the building, he stood near the plaza, watching planes in the distance rise into the sky. Their ascent felt symbolic, each one a reminder that the world could move upward when guided by the right principles. Ethan joined him quietly. "You changed the sky. You know." David didn't answer immediately. He watched another aircraft lift, carving a white arc across the horizon. Finally, he spoke. "I didn't change the sky," he said softly. "I just reminded people how to rise, and somewhere in the quiet between breath and memory." He felt his grandmother's voice again, warm and steady. "Hold your dignity." He did, and the world rose with him. David Carter's story is not just about discrimination. It is about how a man chooses to stand up in the face of adversity, not with a scream, but with the calmness of a man who knows his worth. There will be times in life when we are misunderstood, overlooked, or treated unfairly. What matters is not whether we can avoid it, but how we react when it happens. David did not protest. He did not retaliate. He chose to face it with dignity, a silent strength that is sharper than any protest. It is that attitude that makes an entire system reflect on itself. The lesson here is simple, but profound. Dignity is never something we beg for. It is something we hold. And when we hold it long enough, the world will have to look at how it treats us. At the same time, the story reminds us that change always begins with one person daring to speak the truth, to stand up, to stand for what is right, even if standing up means facing loneliness. But the truth is, when we stand up, we are never truly alone. People move towards justice, and what is right always finds common ground. Thank you for taking the time to follow this emotional story. If you find this content meaningful and worth spreading, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so I can continue to bring you more healing and humane journeys. Thank you from the bottom of my heart.